Alright, I want to give my bit on the story of Apple versus Microsoft. This has been really thrown around a whole lot on YouTube, comes and goes, and has recently resurfaced again. And I'd like to try to set some of the records straight, or perhaps maybe learn a thing or two. Now, let me premise all this by saying, if I'm accused of being an apologist for anything, I would hope that it would be for the truth. So, let's get started. It all starts with what everybody knows, Xerox, or better known as the Palo Alto Research Center at Xerox. A facility where geeks can invent, research and development, do all kinds of things, and not really worry about going to market type things. Just push the envelopes of technology and see where you can go. Well, Apple fits into the picture by a gentleman by the name of Jeff Raskin. He was working at Apple on the appliance computer, codenamed Macintosh. And he would go to these shows and things in relation to Xerox Park and decided to approach Jobs and say, hey, you really need to see what's going on over there. Just, check it out. Jobs didn't really have a whole lot of affinity for Jeff Raskin as I understand it, and pretty much dismissed Raskin's attempts to try to lure him to the Palo Alto Research Center. Well, Raskin had a friend that also worked at Apple. His name was Bill Atkinson. Now, Atkinson had a little bit more pull with Jobs, and once Atkinson was convinced, he was able to sway Jobs into going over to Xerox. So now we have Xerox and Apple forming some sort of relationship here to try to get into that Palo Alto Research Center. It is true that Jobs offered Xerox $1 million worth of shares in return for visits to the Palo Alto Research Center. 100,000 shares at $10 a piece, to be specific. That later, when the stock split, turned out to be 800,000 shares, something like that. Anyway, that is got to be premised by, at the time, President of Apple, Mike Scott. They had a deal for parts from the Shugart division of Xerox, which helped manufacture these floppy drives for Apple. And there were problems and things, but nonetheless they had a contract, right? Well, Apple found a cheaper company in Japan to help them manufacture these floppy drives. And the investment in Apple kind of shielded them from a possible lawsuit from Xerox, as the way they felt some sort of insurance by allowing that investment to take place. So, Apple is allowed these visits, two to be exact. And Jobs, of course, is fascinated. You can kind of see all of this, which is somewhat shown in the movie Pirates of Silicon Valley. But nonetheless, Jobs is blown away. Wow. He wants to take this stuff back to the Lisa team and try to make what he sees at Xerox Park, happen at Apple. Now, the thing of it is that actual blueprints and designs and like direct code was not really given to Apple. It's more of, oh, I see that it can be done, I'm inspired, so now let me go figure out how to do that. So you can't really say, oh, here it is, and then build upon this code type thing. It's more or less, hey, someone sees technology, kind of like what's happening with, let's just say, just for a silly example, like the multi-touch. And other companies see how successful it is. They don't have the exact code from Apple and the multi-touch, but they figure out how to do it in their own way. And that would be analogous to what really went on between what Apple took from Xerox and what Xerox had presented to Apple. From there, Apple starts tinkering and with all this new inspiration and with a lot of very brilliant engineers, and starts building upon what they saw at Xerox, specifically called Smalltalk, where it had the layering windows or pop-up windows, things like that. It had a 3-button mouse, I believe, other things that they were inspired. They took those ideas, built upon those ideas, and added things like cut and paste. They made a 1-button mouse versus the 3, drop-down menus, things like that were added into their own Apple operating system versus what they had seen in Smalltalk at Xerox Park. Now, an important thing to note is that Jobs was kicked off the project by Mike Scott, and that was something that Jobs even quoted, that he was very hurt by that, and we'll never forget it. Of course, that led to Jobs taking over the whole Macintosh project. But it should be noted, a lot of the engineers at Xerox Park defected to Apple. So, in essence, you have the direct people that were working on Smalltalk and all the R&D over there at Park actually now working for Apple and helping Apple achieve many of the things and improving on those things from Park. So what better way to advance the GUI system by having those you employ being those that really had the time to tinker with it and do all the research and development. Jobs is actually quoted in saying, Apple is like an Ellis Island. It's a place for refugees from other companies. They're brilliant in what they do, but they always tended to be a rebel at the companies that they had came from. Now, let's put in the Microsoft story of things. To my knowledge, Bill Gates purchased the Xerox Star, which is the Xerox computer that had all of this technology on it. Both Apple and Microsoft knew about this computer. It had like icons, and that was also what influenced a lot of the Apple desktops and so forth. And I know Gates paid a lot of money to get the Xerox Star. But it should also be noted, while there were defectors from the Xerox Park to Apple, there were also defectors from Xerox Park that went to work for Microsoft. Okay? So you do have engineers from the original creation that's created this Xerox Star computer that have gone to both camps. So now knowledge to build this GUI is in both companies. A lot of the arguments are, well, Apple went about getting the ideas legitimately. I would also argue, since engineers from Park defected to Microsoft as well, once Gates had acquired the Xerox Star, that just as much engineering knowledge went to Microsoft as well. The issue that I take in it being such a clean handshake or agreement between Xerox and Apple is that later Xerox sued Apple for what they felt were copyright infringements. Now, a judge pretty much threw out most of Xerox complaints, but not all of them. But because of that lawsuit, we can't really say that it's a goody two-shoe type agreement, especially also with the whole thing where the floppy drive deals where Apple was trying to find cheaper drives versus using the Shugart division at Xerox to supply the parts for those drives. Okay, so then where does the debacle come where so many Mac fans just have the animosity towards Microsoft? A lot of it, in my opinion, is not so much founded when a lot of the details come out. Businesses do deals and things like that, and Apple certainly had its share. And really, it starts with Microsoft already doing software for the existing Apple cash cows, the Apple II. And Jobs did specifically specify that Microsoft could not lease or do all kinds of license out anything of their applications that they were building specific for the Macintosh that used parts of the GUI and the mouse, so on and so forth, on any non-Apple computer. That agreement did not stipulate that Microsoft could not build an operating system. It was not in the contract. Building their own operating system had no breach in that disclosure that was signed, or the agreement that was in between Microsoft and Apple specific for the development of the Macintosh. So while some of you may be balking at that, think of it this way. Microsoft is dumping a tremendous amount of its resources into Mac software. If the Mac does not do well, they're not going to do well. And at this time, Apple's a giant compared to Microsoft. And if in business you have the IBM PC, which is another market that you could tap into, why not? Problem is the software in the Macintosh is exclusive to the Macintosh. It's not going to be run on an IBM PC. So make an operating system to run on the IBM PC. Now the thing is, yeah, you had DOS, but Gates already understands that the GUI is the future. So they got to make a GUI that's going to run on the IBM PC side of things. It's an insurance, so to speak. If the Macintosh does well, you do well. If the IBM PC does well, you also do well. But if one fails, you got the other, so to speak. Now, there were other deals that went on because there was BASIC for Apple II and Microsoft was involved, and you had this, well, you had Bill Gates discovering Apple building what they called Mac BASIC, and there was already supposed to be something called Microsoft BASIC, and this caused issues and things, which led to Bill Gates stating it's one of his worst decisions he's ever made, was prohibiting or negotiating and prohibiting Apple to not produce this Mac BASIC. Apple did agree to do that, and in the end the Microsoft BASIC didn't turn out to do much. Now, what had happened, at this time Jobs is no longer at Apple. And Windows 1 is up and running, and Apple is still very dependent on the Microsoft software that's running on the Mac. Apple's still making more money than Microsoft, but they're really now becoming dependent on a lot of the Microsoft software, and some programs need refreshing, so on and so forth. Well, another deal was made, and that was Scully's mistake. In that, Scully agreed to license out Mac technology that could be used in Windows, in exchange for Microsoft not releasing some of its spreadsheet programs and database programs until a later date to allow Apple to gain more market share. So Microsoft was going to delay the release of these products on the IBM PC side, while Apple said, "Hey, we'll let you, we'll license this out to you, and you can use it in Windows." And they made that agreement, and that was a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake, because Windows certainly did incorporate a lot of the Mac technology in Windows, and this spurred the lawsuit between Apple and Microsoft. And similar to the Xerox suit against Apple, the Apple suit against Microsoft was in large part thrown out. And HP was also included in that. And so that was a victory for Microsoft and HP against Apple. The thing of it is that Apple tried to argue that the agreement they had was only for the first version of Windows and not to go into the subsequent versions of Windows, of which it was used. And that was fought in court, and Microsoft argued otherwise. They didn't understand the agreement to do that. So you thus had legally licensed out technology in Windows that progressed with the subsequent versions of Windows. Now, this case, of course, had many rulings, but in the end, it was decided that the 1985 agreement between Microsoft and Apple, that those technologies could not be protected by copyright. Also, in another ruling, a judge was very upset at Apple for not showing proof of the similarities and so on and so forth. After appeals, Apple's appeals were pretty much rejected, and so it stayed a Microsoft Hewlett-Packard victory over Apple. The mistakes of Apple gave rise to Microsoft. Period, really. Apple could have held its ground in many cases, and Microsoft likely wouldn't have grown to be what it is today. But really, on decisions that were made throughout Apple's timeline, gave rise to Microsoft. Now, I want to conclude with a quote that I have written down here, just said by Steve Jobs. It says, "When we were developing the Macintosh, we kept in mind a famous quote of Picasso. Good artists copy and great artists steal. What do I think of the suit? I personally don't understand it. Can I copyright gravity? No." That was when Steve Jobs was CEO of Next. So I hope that clarifies the story, the starting stories of the two companies. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that origin story of how the two get into, well, Microsoft always copies Apple, or there's the occasional vice versa argument on that. I agree a lot with what Jobs had said when he was CEO at Next. You can't copyright gravity. Now, does that mean that Apple is not innovative? Of course I agree Apple's innovative. I consider myself a Mac enthusiast. It's my preferred operating system. I have plenty of videos demonstrating my opinions of OS X and Mac. But I will also state, while Apple has been innovative, Microsoft has its share as well. After all, Jobs will admit to you that Apple stopped creating, and that led pretty much to its demise, going from position 1 to almost nothing. And Microsoft, with the whole NT idea, it was brilliant vision. I mean, they were working with SGI, they were going to go OpenGL, so on and so forth. Of course, things changed. I also got disappointed with the roadmap that Microsoft had taken after I had seen all the wonderful innovations that they were creating. So companies innovate and companies can go stale. There are questionable practices or deals that we can all have an opinion on. I personally don't like a lot of the price dumping that Microsoft does, specifically in a lot of these articles I read where one laptop per child, which is a Linux-based type, I guess like a netbook type thing, loses, or even like the Mandriva distro loses sales and potential market share, because when Microsoft goes in and just dumps the price of their products to try to gain that market. There are cases. Obviously, Microsoft was part of the Federal Trade Commission investigations. We also have that now going in with the whole AT&T thing, and everybody's going to have their opinions on things. But nonetheless, hey, this is what goes on. I've always been a fan of a lot of the things that Apple produced, especially like early on with a lot of its hardware. Now I was very young when most of that came out. I wasn't able to enjoy it in my older years, especially when I started learning more about computers. But I began to appreciate them as I became of age and looked back. And we are where we are today. It's fascinating to see. I also wanted to add into this, since it's Apple versus Microsoft, that arguments were being made that now that Apple is Intel, that's a copying of Microsoft. I would use the same Steve Jobs quote in that you can't copyright gravity. x86 has won the personal computing market. I would love to have seen RISC II flourish better than it did. Maybe it'll come back, I don't know. Or maybe Intel will change x86 so much that after all, x86 has adopted many RISC technologies anyway. But there is no such thing as copy by Apple moving to Intel. And I will also premise that in saying I don't believe the whole power per watt argument. IBM later came out and said that Apple wanted to divide the share that IBM had. In other words, being able to license out the manufacturing of those chips to other vendors, so it would spur a little bit more competition and drop the price for Apple to acquire these chips. And that really would have hurt IBM's investment that they had did. I mean, you don't go from keynotes where the G5 is the end-all be-all to, what is it, less than a year later, Intel's the end-all be-all. I mean, you don't go from the G5, 64-bit computing, to a year later bragging about going to, at the time it was Core Duo, a 32-bit type computing. You can say whatever you want about power per watt, but there were definitely RISC alternatives out there. And IBM already was proposing the cell. They had other means of meeting that power per watt. Geez, I mean, let's put it this way. RISC is everywhere in terms of low power computing, especially in mobile devices. I just don't buy it. You can say what you want. I do think the Intel move was smart, because of the software. In business sense, I don't like how they went just Intel. They could have gone AMD and Intel and offered more options for builds. Like in the Mac Pro, you could have Opterons and things if you wanted to, so you could just have different configurations more so than what Intel has to offer. I don't like Apple being locked in what Intel produces in terms of its technology. Just like when Intel finally offers address linear extension in what they dub physical address extension, that, oh, hey, look at this. I mean, that's what Intel did for something that already really existed, and Apple was powerless really to do anything until Intel makes it available on its chips and its chipsets. So I think it would have been a better move to allow more x86 chips in there, and also on their server still support a lot of the RISC side, and maybe made deals with IBM or Sun at the time, and maybe things could have been different. It's wishful thinking, but in the end, I think it's a very big software move. Next Step already could run on x86. OS X really had nothing in it that prevented it from running on the Intel chips, being based upon the Next Step operating system, which already ran on Intel and ran on a few other architectures. They were really good to go. That said, all the software is on x86. You want to compete, go where the software is. That's what runs these bad boys. That's what we go for. It's the applications in the end that we need. Now, in terms of people saying, well, OS X is like Windows 7 and vice versa, I've made comments in terms of progression. Vista to Windows 7 is an incremental advancement, just like OS X has been incremental advancements. I can't really say that Microsoft took a path that was like OS X. OS X was built upon the Mach microkernel, used a lot of open source technology, introduced it, made their own branding on it, whereas Microsoft really started off building their own stuff. It was completely, really isolated from what most other companies were doing. And they would build these separate technologies that were specific to their kernels that they really built on. While in principle, all the execution is there in the x86, and really that's an Intel thing at the time because AMD was in the RISC market in the beginning. Yeah, you could say it was a merriment of Intel in Microsoft, but all those layers that Microsoft has built up, which is really proprietary to them. They've made all kinds of technology specifically to be just Windows in that, versus OS X, which has taken tons of open source technology, has contributed some stuff back to it, but they are even now working with open source communities like in OpenGL, the new compilers like Clang and stuff like that. So very different approaches, and boy is it hard to say one copies the other. You can say it aesthetically, I guess. Obviously there are some things that do stand out. I do think the Microsoft Store is a bit much. But they probably just see, well, Apple's successful, let's give it a shot. I even saw a Sony store in the mall the other day. So, people are seeing that, and will they be as successful? Who knows? But I definitely see that the example was set by Apple, and others wanted to try to follow and see if that same benefit, they would receive that same kind of outcome. Anyway, thanks for watching.